were raised by a generally or almost completely untreated borderline parent, there's a very good chance that you have some form of anxiety and also depression and just a lifetime increased history of psychiatric issues. These are well documented in the literature and research. And this is not to put any blame or shade on borderline parents who struggle in their own right, but to unpack why you may have anxiety specifically around having a parent like this. Now, when we talk about anxiety today, I'm talking about everything in terms of all the anxiety disorders, from generalized anxiety to panic disorder to specific phobias. All of those things can often have their roots in certain types of attachment stories and childhoods. And so that's what this video is about. So we're going to go through the typical signs and symptoms in borderline, and I'll explain how those manifest in anxiety in you today. Then we'll talk a bit about sort of, how to think about that and what lens to look at it from your own childhood. And I'll just give you a few quick tips and ideas at the end of the video to focus on your anxiety. All right? So let's get started and talk about anxiety in general. It is often this pervasive sense of worry and discomfort. You can have fatigue, insomnia. I always describe it as a sort of angsty on edge. And while it can vary in how it shows up, it has its roots often in that hyper-vigilant fight or flight response. And when you think about a borderline parent who often struggles with emotional stability and relational stability and their own sense of self, their own difficulties with maybe impulsivity or risk-taking behavior, obviously things like suicidal behavior, the whole spectrum of BPD is so complex. On one end, you can have a parent who was just sort of a rageaholic and sort of that love-hate dynamic and never predictable. On the other end, a very much more low-key, but very emotionally, intense parent who may have felt very oftentimes rejected and wounded, neglected, and or manifested their borderline in what may also kind of have some similarities to that more covert narcissism type concept. So it really can vary and everything in between. But at the core of the symptomatology of borderline, we have 9 really main criteria. So let's go through those and talk about how those might affect the development of your anxiety in childhood and today. But actually, before I do that, I also want to quickly say that why we might have anxiety is very much also researched, in that those who are at more risk for anxiety tended to have a certain type of temperament, often a more shy or reserved temperament, often in homes where there was a mismatch, and or just in general, they were very sensitive to the world around them. So you can imagine if you're a sensitive kid, just in general, and maybe your borderline parent is also sensitive, but also active in their borderline struggles, that is going to be very intrusive for you, probably in many different ways, especially when they are activated. The next thing we see is that exposure to stressful or negative life events, the chronic CPTSD environments, all of those are going to raise our risk for anxiety being a difficult issue for us as adults. And obviously things like a history in the family, a predisposition or hereditary issue around anxiety potentially could be an issue. And then even certain medical illnesses that you may have developed in that classic CPTSD situation, like chronic illnesses, they can have components of anxiety in them as well. So oftentimes, as we discussed, I think as in this video I made about the relationship, the very well documented relationship between childhood trauma and complex trauma and our development of, chronic illnesses like autoimmune, fibromyalgia, diabetes, cancer, all of those, certainly many of those can have components that either directly or indirectly contribute to anxiety. Okay. Back to the criteria and how that works. Now, as I go through all of these, I want you to be thinking about your trauma responses, the classic autonomic nervous system response. The idea that at all times, our nervous systems are reading the room. They are reading people even before we make the connections, right? That's that emotional brain part and the limbic part of the brain. That's the fight or flight here. This part of the brain is the cortex part, the cortical part, right? So like right here, we have our prefrontal cortex. So when we're operating as a child, oftentimes in that limbic area, that emotional part of the brain, and obviously memory can get impacted there too, and memory is also in this area. All of that can create a situation where as adults, we're not doing a good job of integrating the cortical part and the emotional limbic part. We often blow, right? And I just made a TikTok on this, but we often blow. And so when we have a childhood with a lot of chaos and unpredictability, we're often doing this blowing thing or managing a parent who's blowing a lot, and it's triggering us at our deeply sort of nervous system level. And so that is why why we say trauma lives in the body, that we just can't just wake up one day and just do some cognitive thinking, although it can help. It's not enough. We need integration, right? So be thinking about how your body was reacting. Even if the parent went from super, aggressive to soothing, you had to go on the ride first with the aggression or the anger or the rage or the blame or their own sort of destruction, okay? So the first one, number one, is the frantic efforts to avoid abandonment. This is very common with those with borderline. And that frantic part, think about that word frantic. That means that the borderline parent is frantic often in all that they're doing to avoid that feeling of abandonment. And you may have watched that occur with their partner, in their friendships, and with you as a child, right? And so all of that is your awareness of there's this deep emotional intensity and it's got a franticness to it, like a panicness to it, that you are going to absorb as a result of being exposed to that, being modeled, by the parent in that way, and or mirroring their nervous system and taking on their own emotions in terms of that fear too. And so that in life can also be an issue for you, not just the abandonment, but that franticness about being left or being alone or not being enough, things like that. And that really goes to number two, which is the pattern of unstable relationships. This is a very common part of BPD. In fact, I would say relational instability and emotional instability are usually the two biggest ones you're going to find in some form. And that also goes with that frantic desire to not be left, right? And so you're going to feel that they're constantly having relationship issues with their other kids, with you, with their friends, with their partner, and their emotional intensity makes it hard for them not to. So that means you're all operating on that hypervigilant state, and you also don't know where you stand. And as a child seeking attachment and connection and security, if you're not sure if you're the good or the bad kid in the typical splitting situation that borderlines often struggle with, that idealization, you're the wonderful, most greatest thing ever, you're wonderful, and devaluation, you're the worst parent, partner, child ever, that not knowing where you stand is also very anxiety provoking from an attachment perspective if you're a child. The next one is identity disturbance, which is very common in borderline. And so this is that role confusion about who they are, who they're going to be. And don't forget as kids, so I do believe this, that although we always say kids are resilient, you'll hear me say, I don't think they're as resilient as we say. I think we say that to feel better. And oftentimes symptomatology is not recognized or seen or acted out later. But the idea is that if you're not sure who you are, then how am I sure who you are? And so how can you be consistently stable for me as a person if one day you're into this, the next day you're doing that? That also creates an insecurity, which really fosters a more anxious or disorganized attachment pattern. Number four is impulsivity. And a lot of those who struggle with BPD have impulsivity, right? And so same thing. If you don't know if we're going to get in the car and drive 90 miles an hour to the store and buy that toy I wanted, or get mad at the other parent and, break everything in the house, or decide to purchase a bunch of things and everything is great today, all of that is that same thing going back to a child doesn't know what they're going to get. And because a parent can be so unpredictable in their impulsivity, if that goes along with rage, let's say, it also may put you in danger. And so you need to stay as a child hypervigilant to protect yourself and or be mindful of what the parent's doing that might put you at risk. Even if you can't stop it, over time you recognize the pattern and become very much tapped into that awareness. The next one, number five, is often recurrent suicidal gestures or self-harm or behaviors. That one I think is really more explanatory. Obviously that can lead to depressive symptoms too. For children, we'll discuss depression and BPD in another video. And oftentimes those with borderline are struggling with depression. And so if suicidal behavior or threats or comments, I'll just leave. Fine, I'll just never be here anymore. You don't love me or whatever. Or they are just actively in their suicidality or self-harming, even through other more hurtful self-harming behaviors, that's going to make it stressful for you as a child and going to increase your anxiety. Next one is the other one which I really talked a lot about, which is affective instability, emotional instability, meaning that you just don't know what you're going to get. And so maybe today, in this hour, your parent who struggled was loving and available and connected, which I keep saying, I really do believe borderlines, when they're able to function, within a certain range, challenge, they really do want to be in relationships. And so the problem is they're often so easily hurt or wounded or rejected or feeling threatened that there'll be abandonment, that it can snap like that. And so that's a walking on eggshells dynamic that is really the hallmark of the emotional dysregulation in borderline. And so if you're a child of that, you don't know what you're going to get. And so you are, once again, we're back to hypervigilance, right? And or figuring out what you need to do to survive. And so that is going to really affect you. And as we often take on our parents' emotions in that sort of mirror neuron engagement situation we do, where we're, reading each other's bodies and nervous systems and mirroring back emotions and thoughts and experiences, then if a parent is also really anxious, which oftentimes borderlines are, because if you think about all the things they're dealing with at times, that is also very stressful and anxiety provoking. Number 7 is chronic feelings of emptiness. And so this is where the parent with borderline often just doesn't feel like they can be enough, right? They constantly feel empty inside or less than inside. And so as a child, if you either hear them say those things or you watch that experience happen, it makes you once again exist in a very insecure place. And you may also feel like it's your responsibility to fill up for that parent. And oftentimes parents with this disorder might be overly expressive of their adult thoughts, feelings, emotions, whatever it is, relationships. They share too much sometimes. And oftentimes that becomes like your responsibility. You become the parentified child, right? It's your job to make this parent okay, or to give them meaning in life or fill them up. And that is just too much of a burden for a child. But you will keep carrying that through your adult life, which is a very stressful thing to do, to walk around always feeling responsible for everyone else's emotions and feelings. Number 8 is a big one. It's the intense, oftentimes in the classic BPD situation, rage or anger. And very quick, very sudden, very intense can be, it can be very wounding and aggressive and hurtful. It can be verbal abuse, it could be emotional abuse. It could be just them losing their control of themselves. And that obviously at its core is going to make you oftentimes fearful of conflict and or become a ragey yourself. And so your anxiety level staying high keeps you aware and alert of when there might be a conflict coming. So you can avoid it, escape it, engage in it, whatever you need to do in your own trauma responses. But that can be very stressful, because if you avoid conflict, because conflict equals danger in your childhood, because your borderline parent was at a minimum scary, not even hurtful, but just scary in their rage, which, let's not kid ourselves, when we're raging and angry, it's scary for our kids. Even when we get older, we all lose it. But there's a variation there where it becomes repetitive and scary and dangerous, and the kids are reading that. And so that is definitely going to contribute to those fears around what may come, even if it's just, not even if it's breaking things or leaving the house or raging or whatever. And that really does go back into the trauma responses, right? And so we're looking at that freeze, fight, fawn, freeze, collapse, submit, all of those, which I discussed, I believe, in this video, and I'll discuss more. So thinking about that is important to know that that affects your anxiety as well. And lastly, there can be a dissociation, the sort of transient nature of ideation, of paranoia, or dissociation. That's often for borderlines when they're in that deep, intense emotion. They can sort of have memory loss or not know where they're going somewhere, or just be disconnected in terms of what's happening for you. And if your parent is there but not there, that's very stressful, because on some core for you, we often can feel abandoned as well, right? You're not available to me. You certainly can't attune to your child in a dissociative state. And so that is also very anxiety provoking. So really what happens for those of us with this sort of issue is that we, as I said, we often are hypervigilant. Oftentimes with parents like this, or any parent who has a difficulty struggling with any kind of emotional consistency, we often go into that thinking that, well, if I'm just the perfect child, if I can get it right, we overdo. We try to read the situations at all times to protect ourselves. And that can tie into that sort of classic inner and outer critic thinking, right? Where it's like we criticize ourselves, we criticize the world, because we're always trying to get it perfect and right. And in our minds, somehow, that is going to keep us safe from the anxiety, from the fear, from the parents' unpredictability, from all of that stuff that psychologically is so scary, but that we've had to deal with in our childhoods. Obviously, you may still also be in a trauma bond with this parent of borderline. I see this a lot. And so they're activating your anxiety all the time. You're a grown, human, but you talk on the phone, or when you do talk to them, it stresses you out. They hang up on you. They get mad at you. They criticize you. Whatever it is, you are actively still in the relationship as a child, except for there's a little bit of a shift there. Lastly, you may also be struggling with emotional flashbacks, which I discussed in this video. But it may be that you're so often triggered by your own family because you kind of like one little thing happens and you're off into that trauma response, thinking about some event or just feeling that feeling of, like I've said in other videos, I'm on my own. I have to solve this by myself. You come in the door, the house is a mess, no one's doing anything, and it can trigger that, oh my God, this is all on me, just like it was in childhood. And then that can link back to your mom, coming home from work and being enraged because you hadn't done the dishes, right? We can get transported back in time to all of those things. And the root of all of those is going to be hypervigilance, which is often the source of anxiety. So what can you do about it really quickly? I would suggest obviously doing the classic anxiety reduction techniques around mindfulness and breathing, progressive muscle relaxation, journaling, clearly doing things that help you focus on your body and mind and soul sort of trauma responses. So doing body work, looking at yoga and meditation. I love guided imagery. That's a really helpful one, I think, because it's so much easier than the classic typical meditation. But doing things that help you make those mind-body connections to the body trauma of the anxiety are really helpful. Obviously, you want to address relationships. If you're in a relationship with a parent still who is still very triggering, learning to set boundaries and decide what you need to do about that and getting help and support to do that. I'm going to make a video soon on no contact with BPD parents and what that looks like. And clearly things like therapy can be very, very helpful. In fact, I would highly suggest if you can get any sort of therapy support, therapeutic support, if you're trying to work on these issues, because these are really often about trauma at the core. It's not just anxiety. Most oftentimes the anxiety, especially in certain stories, is very much linked to trauma, complex trauma in childhood, and also PTSD, right? Because parents who struggle often find themselves in traumatic situations that you might just be, by proxy exposed to. And lastly, I would say things like self-compassion exercises that really focus on awareness and mindfulness, that acknowledge your suffering, that acknowledge common humanity, that acknowledge that there are, ways to sort of lovingly embrace yourself. And I'll post more of those. I think I made a video on self-compassion before, but I'll be making more soon. But I would highly suggest selfcompassion.org, Kristen Neff's website, for all of those in terms of self-compassion. So I know this is a longer video. I may not post another video this week. I've got a lot going on, but I really do want you to know that so much of these symptoms we struggle with are very much related to our childhoods. And so you can maybe take the weight off yourself. It's like, why can't I just stop stressing and worrying? We can also have OCD and other issues that are related to all of this. And so I'll discuss more on that soon too. But thanks for watching. Please don't forget to subscribe and click the bell if you want to be a part of this little growing community. I am so excited to watch it keep growing. And I'm still trying to get my groove going on TikTok, but I'm trying to make little tiny videos on a bunch of different topics, not just the ones on this channel. So I hope you will follow me there too, and feel free to share and post your feedback, and I will see you soon. Thanks for watching, guys. Take care and stay safe. Bye.